The furnace in the Harlow Building kicked on every morning at 4:47. Not 4:45. Not 4:50. 4:47. I know this because I'd been sleeping in the basement mechanical room for 11 months, and the furnace was my alarm clock. That was the thing nobody told me when I took the maintenance job. Not that the furnace ran early. Everybody knew that. What nobody mentioned was that the humidity sensor in the archive room drifted. Every single day. You'd calibrate it Tuesday morning, get it sitting right at 42%, and by Thursday it was reading 61, and the climate control system was throwing errors, and the museum director was sending emails in all caps about preservation standards. I'd fix it. I'd fix it again. And then I'd fix it on Thursday because that's what the job was. I'd been doing it for about 11 months by then. 11 months of resetting sensors, checking locks at midnight, walking the floors at 2 a.m., replacing light bulbs in hallways that smelled like old plaster and machine oil. It was a good job. I mean that genuinely. Nobody expected anything from me except showing up and doing the physical stuff and the quiet stuff, and I was always good at both. I'd spent most of my 20s getting good at them in places that weren't Oregon. The Harlow Building was a repurposed warehouse on the Astoria waterfront. Built in the 1890s as a cannery, converted sometime in the 70s into mixed use. Artist studios on the upper floors. A small maritime museum on the ground floor with old fishing boats and navigation equipment, and a decommissioned Coast Guard lifeboat that tourists like to photograph their kids sitting in. Storage in the basement. And me, sleeping on a cot behind the boiler because the job came with access but not housing, and I'd made the adjustment myself. The building had a personality. I don't mean that in the whimsical sense. I mean the pipes groaned at specific times. The elevator shaft breathed, a low rhythmic draft that came from somewhere below the basement level and moved through the building like respiration. The loading docks smelled like creosote and river silt no matter how many times I hosed it down. The third-floor stairwell had a cold spot on the landing that never warmed up regardless of season. I walked through it every night on my 2 a.m. round, and every night it was there, sitting in the same 6 square feet of air like it had an appointment. The tourists liked to ask questions. That was fine. They'd come through the museum during the day and want to know about the old boats and the fishing history and whether the building was haunted, and I'd answer in as few words as I could manage, and they'd walk away thinking I was just a quiet maintenance worker who liked old buildings. Which was mostly accurate. The part they missed was the lockpick set in my boot. I kept it in a leather roll tucked against my right ankle, the kind of set with tension wrenches and diamond picks, and a snake rake that cost more than anything else I owned. Not standard maintenance equipment, obviously. I just never felt right without something precise in reach. And a lockpick set was legal. And it was quiet. And if you knew how to use it, it was something else entirely. I'd had it since I left federal service 4 years earlier. Carried it every single day, without really thinking about it anymore. That's just me. The other thing I kept hidden was the scar. Not a tattoo. A thin white line running along my right collarbone, about 4 inches long, slightly raised at the edges. I wore my Carhartt jacket over it year-round. Even in August, when the coast warmed up enough that tourists walked the Riverwalk in tank tops, I kept the collar up and the jacket on. Astoria runs cool enough that nobody looked twice. I needed nobody looking twice. The whole point of the maintenance job was that nobody noticed anything about me. That I was just the woman who reset the humidity sensor and replaced the light bulbs. That the part of me that had spent 6 years on the FBI art crime team tracking stolen artifacts across 3 continents was somewhere far underwater. Quiet. Done. The routine was good for that. Monday. Locks and sensor calibration. Tuesday. Light bulbs and loading dock maintenance. Wednesday. Walk the upper floors and check the artist studio thermostats because 2 of them ran hot and the painters complained. It worked most of the time. I didn't think about what it meant that I needed it to work. Lunch was usually around 11. I'd walk 3 blocks down toward the waterfront and stop at Dale Osrich's place, which he called a bookshop but was really just the bottom floor of his house with some shelves and a cash register that I never once saw him use. He sold used maritime histories. River charts from the 40s. Old logging company records with hand-drawn maps of timber claims that didn't exist anymore. Nobody bought them. I don't think that was the point. He'd have coffee ready. I never figured out how he always knew I was coming. I didn't keep a strict schedule. Some days I came at 11. Some days it was closer to noon. But whenever I pushed through the door with a bell that made its small tired sound, there were 2 cups on the counter. Black for me. Something from a bottle he kept on the bottom shelf added to his. Dale was 74, maybe older. Thick white beard trimmed close to the jaw. Hands permanently curved from decades of working nets. The fingers stiff at the joints in a way that looked painful, but he never mentioned. He wore the same brown wool vest every day over a flannel shirt regardless of season. His eyes were the pale gray that comes from years of watching water in every kind of light. He moved slow and deliberate, like he had all the time in the world and knew something you didn't. He sold old books and he talked. That was the whole arrangement. I'd bring him something, usually a gas station sandwich because I'm not imaginative, and he'd hand me coffee and talk for about 30 minutes and then I'd walk back. His stories were always about 2 things: the river and the building. Not the Columbia River like salmon counts and shipping traffic and whether the bar pilots were running. The river like something with memory, something that kept track. And not the Harlow Building like square footage and renovation permits and who rented which studio on the 4th floor. The building like something that collected things, that had opinions about what it kept and what it let go. He'd talk about Elias Harlow, the original owner, a cannery operator who'd built the place in 1891 with cheap lumber and cheaper labor, most of it Chinese workers brought up from San Francisco and Portland. Dale talked about Harlow the way you talk about a neighbor you didn't trust, not with anger, just with the careful precision of someone who'd been paying attention for a long time. He talked about the Harlow Ledger, a logbook supposedly that Elias had kept. It recorded the cannery's transactions, fish counts, payroll, equipment orders, but also other things. Workers who vanished from the rolls without explanation. Inventory entries that didn't correspond to any known goods. Rooms in the building's original floor plans that couldn't be found when you walked the actual halls. The building keeps its own books, Dale said to me once. We were in the 2 chairs he kept behind the counter, the wooden ones with the cracked seats, and he said it the same way he'd mention a weather forecast. Casually. Settled. Which rooms? I said. He waved his cup vaguely. Depends on when you look. I drank my coffee and didn't push it. I liked Dale's stories. There was something in them that felt genuinely old, and he told them straight, not like he was performing anything, not like he was trying to scare me or impress me. Just telling it. But I also figured every old industrial building on the Oregon coast had versions of these stories. Workers who disappeared into the historical record. Rooms that didn't match the blueprints because buildings got renovated and records got lost. Sounds in the walls because old buildings have pipes and old pipes have air in them and air moves. I told myself that every time I walked back to the Harlow Building. I was wrong about all of it. But I didn't find out until later. About a week before everything started, we were in the chairs behind the counter. Dale had a river chart spread on his lap, an old one, hand-drawn, showing the channel depths from before the jetties were built. He was studying it the way you'd study a face you were trying to remember. The building's been restless, he said. I looked at him. He didn't look up from the chart. Things are moving that shouldn't be. The lower floors have been cold. Colder than the system accounts for. I said something like, and ate my sandwich. That's not me being dismissive. I'd noticed the cold too. The basement mechanical room where I slept had dropped 4 degrees over the past week for no reason the HVAC system could explain. I'd checked the ducts. I'd checked the vents. Everything was running the way it should have been running. It was just colder. Dale folded the chart carefully along its original creases. If you find a room you haven't seen before, he said. Both hands on the chart. Eyes on me now. And there's something on the floor in the center of it. A coin, a button, a piece of bone. He paused. Placed. Not dropped. Set there like it means something. He looked at me directly. Close the door. Walk away. Don't take it. I asked what kind of something. You'll know it, he said. It won't belong to the building. But it'll look right. It'll look like it was put there on purpose. He said the word offering carefully, like he was setting it down on a surface that might not hold the weight. Leave it alone. Don't touch it. Don't move it. Don't take it. I said okay. He looked at me to see if I meant it. I must have looked like I did because he picked up his coffee again and didn't push further. I'm not going to tell you to quit, he said. You're not going to anyway. No, I said. He nodded. Just keep the lights on. I finished my coffee, left the cup on his counter next to a stack of unsold river charts, walked back to the building through the afternoon fog. Rachel Pine showed up on a Wednesday. I was in the basement mechanical room around 5 in the evening, overcast outside, the river flat and gray through the loading dock's open bay. I was recalibrating the humidity sensor again, the one that drifted, the one that always drifted, and I had my head inside the access panel with the multimeter in one hand when I heard the footsteps. Not museum visitor footsteps. Those are wandering, hesitant, the shuffle and stop of people reading placard text. These were deliberate, measured, descending the concrete stairs from the ground floor with the specific cadence of someone who knew where they were going and wasn't particularly interested in being subtle about it. I pulled my head out of the panel, wiped my hands on my jeans, stood up. She came around the corner of the boiler housing. Tall, angular face with sharp cheekbones and a jaw that looked like it had opinions. Dark hair cut short and practical, the kind of cut that said she'd stopped caring what it looked like sometime around the same time she'd started caring about other things more. Late 40s, maybe. Hard to tell, because she had the kind of face that had been making decisions in difficult rooms for a long time and had stopped aging in the conventional sense because of it. Blazer over a dark shirt. Slacks. Low shoes that were functional rather than fashionable. The blazer hung wrong on the right hip, where the sidearm was sitting. I clocked that in maybe 2 seconds. Then the posture, shoulders back, but not stiff. Weight on the balls of her feet. The specific stance of someone who'd been trained to enter rooms and had never fully stopped doing it. I knew what she was before she opened her mouth. I just didn't know which version yet. Jessica Marin Kowalski, she said. Not a question. She said my full name the way you'd read a file heading. Confirming, not asking. I put the multimeter down on the workbench. Jessie's fine. Dr. Rachel Pine. She didn't extend her hand. She looked around the mechanical room, the cot, the sleeping bag, the hot plate, the coffee mug on the upturned crate I used as a nightstand, and I watched her catalog all of it without judgment. Just data. Just information being filed. You've been with the FBI art crime team for 6 years, she said. 3 continents. 17 recoveries. You had the highest case closure rate in the division for 4 consecutive years. I didn't say anything. You left the bureau after an incident in Ankara. 2019, the consulate basement. She said it the way Sutherland types say things like that. Flat. Factual. Letting the reference do the work. You were good at finding things that didn't want to be found, she said. That's why I'm here. I leaned against the workbench and crossed my arms. Who's missing? She told me about Victor Solis. 58 years old. Private collector out of Portland. The kind of collector who operated in the space between legal and gray, not quite a fence, not quite legitimate. He dealt in historical documents, artifacts, things that had provenance if you didn't look too hard, and didn't if you did. He'd been inside the Harlow Building 3 weeks earlier. Visited the museum's archive room after hours. He'd arranged access through the museum director, a woman named Beth who was easy to charm and easier to bribe, though Rachel didn't use that word. Supposedly, he was examining historical cannery records for a book he was writing. He hadn't come out. Not dramatically. Not like a disappearance you'd see on the news. He'd simply stopped communicating. Stopped answering calls. His car was still in the parking lot of a motel in Astoria where he'd been staying. His phone went to voicemail and then stopped going to voicemail And then the number was disconnected. His daughter, Elena Solis, was the client. She wanted her father found quietly. No police investigation generating headlines that might illuminate the nature of Victor's collection business. No media. No scrutiny. Rachel was running it through a private investigation firm. She had part of a team put together. She needed someone who knew the building. Someone comfortable working in confined spaces. Someone who could read a room, literally and figuratively. I looked at her. She looked back at me with dark brown eyes that were doing the same thing mine were doing, running calculations, assessing angles, measuring the distance between what was being said and what was being meant. No, I said. She nodded slowly, like that was expected. She reached into her blazer pocket. I was already reading the geometry of the mechanical room, the distance to the stairs, the position of the workbench, the weight of the multimeter in case I needed something in my hand. Not because I thought she'd hurt me, just because that's what my body does when someone reaches into a pocket after I've said no. It wasn't a weapon. It was a manila envelope. Standard size. She set it on the workbench next to the multimeter. Ankara, she said. 2019, the consulate basement. What you found there, and what you did about it. I didn't touch the envelope. I didn't need to open it to know what it probably contained. The investigation into what I'd done in Ankara had gone quiet because enough people wanted it quiet. I'd exceeded my authority. I'd made choices that weren't mine to make. People had been hurt. Not the right people, not the wrong people, just people who'd been standing in the space between a stolen artifact and the person I was trying to take it from. The investigation got shelved. Shelved isn't the same as gone. That's just paperwork and someone making a phone call. Charges that get archived, Rachel said, can get unarchived. The furnace kicked on. 4:47 p.m., which was wrong. It ran at 4:47 a.m. It had never once kicked on in the evening in 11 months. I looked at the furnace. I looked at Rachel. I looked at the envelope. Okay, I said. Rachel nodded once. Okay. That was the whole negotiation. Maybe 30 seconds. She had the team mostly assembled already, which meant she'd been planning this whether I said yes or not. I was probably always the last piece. That bugged me a little, but I filed it and moved on. She laid it out over coffee in the mechanical room, my coffee from my hot plate in mugs I washed in the utility sink. Rachel stood while she talked. I sat on the cot. Marco Reeves, she said first. 36. Former Army combat medic, now EMT in Portland. She pulled up a photo on her phone. I recognized him immediately. Not from the Army, from the Bureau. He'd been my field support on 3 artifact recoveries overseas. He was the reason a job in Istanbul hadn't ended with me in a Turkish hospital. He was also one of the most aggressively direct people I'd ever worked with. He agreed to this? I said. He agreed when he heard you were leading it. I didn't know what to do with that, so I moved on. Suki Tanaka. 41. Structural engineer. Specializes in historical buildings, old industrial, multiple renovations, the kind with layers of architecture stacked on top of each other, like geological strata. Her photo showed a compact woman with short-cropped hair and a measuring tape clipped to her belt like it was part of her body. She looked like someone who showed up and did the thing without needing to talk about it first. Owen Chase. 23. Reed College history grad student. His thesis is on Chinese labor in Oregon canneries, 1870 to 1920. He's been inside the Harlow archive 3 times. His photo showed a thin kid in a flannel shirt and round glasses, squinting at whoever was taking the picture like he wasn't sure he'd agreed to it. He was 23 and looked 23. He looked like someone hoping nobody asked him anything hard. Does he know what he's getting into? I said. He knows it's a recovery operation. He knows there's a missing person involved. Does he know it might get complicated? Rachel picked up her coffee. He'll figure it out. Great. That was great. They gathered at the building after hours. I let them in through the loading dock at 9 p.m. The river fog was thick, The kind that turns streetlights into smudges and makes the whole waterfront feel like it's wrapped in wet cotton. Marco was first. He came through the loading dock door with his medkit already strapped to his thigh and looked at my face, and then at Rachel's face, and then back at me with an expression he'd had a lot of practice giving me over the years. One that said, "I know you didn't choose this, and I'm here anyway, and we're not going to talk about it." "Hey," I said. "Don't," he said. Suki arrived with a rolling tool case and a flashlight already in her hand. She shook my hand once, firm, and said, "Show me the floor plans," before she'd fully stepped inside. Owen was last. He came in carrying a daypack the size of a small refrigerator and immediately started telling me about the building's original timber frame construction. I let him go for about 30 seconds and then told him we could cover the structural history inside. He nodded fast. "Right. Yes. Sorry." The building smelled like old brick and machine oil, and something underneath both of those that I'd never quite been able to name. I'd been sleeping in this building for 11 months, and I still couldn't name it. I was about to find out what it was. We started in the archive room, because that was the last place Victor Solis had been confirmed alive. Long room. Metal shelving running floor to ceiling on both sides. Bankers' boxes of cannery records stacked 3 deep on every shelf, payroll ledgers, shipping manifests, equipment orders, correspondence with suppliers in Portland and San Francisco. Old photographs in acid-free sleeves. The kind of room that smells like old paper and cedar and dust that hasn't been disturbed in decades. The museum kept it climate-controlled. That was the whole reason for the humidity sensor that drifted. The paper was fragile. The photographs were fragile. Everything in this room was old and breakable and worth preserving, and the building's HVAC system had exactly one opinion about that, which was to do whatever it wanted regardless of my calibrations. Owen found it first. He knew what he was looking for because he'd been in this room 3 times for his thesis research, and he knew the shelf layout the way a librarian knows the Dewey Decimal System, not from memorizing it, but from living inside it. He stopped at the 3rd shelf on the east wall, reached up, ran his fingers along the spines of a row of ledgers, and stopped at a gap. "It's gone," he said. I came over. The gap was about 2 inches wide. The inventory card was still in its slot on the shelf edge, a small white card with a catalog number and a description typed on an actual typewriter. Harlow, E. General Ledger, 1891 to 1903. Operations and miscellaneous. The Harlow Ledger. The one Dale had told me about. The one that supposedly recorded not just transactions, but other things. Disappearances. Rooms that couldn't be found. Inventory that didn't match. "Victor took it," Rachel said. Not a question. She was already looking at something else. Suki was at the back wall of the archive room. She had her measuring tape out and was running it along the baseboard from the corner to the far end. She did it twice. Then she pulled out her phone and opened what looked like a blueprint file, a PDF of the building's structural plans. "This wall is wrong," she said. I walked over. She held up the phone so I could see the floor plan. The archive room, according to the original 1891 blueprints, extended 4 feet further east than the physical room did. There was supposed to be more space behind this wall. "The brickwork isn't original," she said. She was running her hands along the surface now, pressing with her fingertips, feeling the mortar lines. "The bond pattern matches the original, but the mortar composition is different. This is a later edition, maybe 1940s. Someone sealed this wall shut." "Why?" Owen said. Nobody answered that. I was about to say something practical, something about getting a pry bar, about being systematic, when I caught the smell. Not the usual archive room smell. Not paper and cedar. Something colder, wetter, like river silt and old copper pushed through a closed space. The same mineral smell I'd noticed in the basement sometimes, the one that sat underneath the machine oil and the creosote. But stronger now. Concentrated. Coming from behind the false wall like it had been waiting for someone to stand close enough to notice. Marco caught it too. "I saw his weight shift," Saw his hand go to his medkit strap and adjust it. Old habit. His body was reading the environment before his brain had caught up, same as mine. Owen put his ear to the wall. He went very still. Stayed there for maybe 5 seconds with his eyes closed and his glasses pressed against the brick. Then he stepped back. "There's air moving behind this," he said. His voice was steady, but his breathing wasn't. "And something else." "Something else," I said. He adjusted his glasses. Like pages turning. Nobody laughed. I wish someone would. Rachel was already examining the wall with a small flashlight, running the beam along the mortar lines with the focused efficiency of someone documenting an expected finding. Her face did something I couldn't quite name. Not surprise. Not concern. The opposite. Like a number had come back the way she'd expected it to, and now she could stop wondering. I tucked that away. "We open it tonight," she said. I looked at the wall. The smell was getting stronger. The air behind it was moving, and it shouldn't have been. This building had been my home for 11 months, and I'd just discovered it had rooms I'd never seen. I thought about Dale's voice. Unhurried. Careful. "If you find a room you haven't seen before." "Yeah," I said. "Let's go." Suki directed the breach. She identified the weakest mortar lines, the points where the 1940s repair work met the original 1890s construction, and we worked quietly. No power tools. Just a pry bar, a rubber mallet, and patience. The bricks came out one at a time. I stacked them neatly against the shelving as we removed them, which I did without thinking about it, because order is how I manage situations I can't control. Marco noticed me doing it. He didn't say anything. He never did. The opening grew. 1 brick wide. Then 2. Then wide enough to fit a person. The air that came through was cold. Not basement cold. Not HVAC malfunction cold. The kind of cold that has weight to it. The kind that sits on your skin and stays there and makes you aware of every inch of exposed surface on your body. And the smell, river silt and copper, and something underneath both of those. Something organic. Like wetwood rotting from the inside out over a very long time. I shine my flashlight through the gap. Not a room. A corridor. Narrow, original brick on both sides, running perpendicular to the archive room and extending in both directions into darkness that swallowed the beam after about 15 feet. The floor was wood plank, old growth, warped and buckled from decades of moisture. The ceiling was low, maybe 6.5 feet. I'd have to duck slightly. Marco would have to duck a lot. Suki went through first because she said it was her professional obligation to assess structural integrity before anyone else entered, and because I think she needed to see it with her own hands before she believed it. She came back 45 seconds later. Her face was careful, controlled, but her eyes were doing something new. "It's stable," she said. "Old, but stable. Whoever built this knew what they were doing." "What's in there?" I said. She looked at me. "You need to see it." I went through. Rachel followed. Then Marco. Owen hesitated at the opening for about 2 seconds, adjusted his glasses, and came through last. The corridor walls had marks on them. Not graffiti. Not water damage. Tally marks. Scratched into the brick at irregular intervals with something sharp, a nail, maybe, or a piece of metal. Some in groups of 5, the standard counting pattern. Others in longer sequences, dozens of marks in a single row, scratched deep enough that the brick had worn smooth around them. Owen photographed them. His hands were steady. I noticed that, and filed it. We went left because Rachel said left. I noticed she didn't consult Suki's floor plans when she chose the direction. She didn't hesitate. She just turned left and started walking like she knew where the corridor went. I filed that too. My filing cabinet was getting full. The corridor ran about 40 feet and then opened into a room. Square. Maybe 12 by 12. Brick walls, no windows, no ventilation that I could see. The air should have been stale, but it wasn't. It was moving slowly, coming from somewhere below, carrying that cold mineral smell up through the floor, like breath. A single wooden chair sat in the center. Old. Spindle legs. The kind of chair you'd find in a farmhouse kitchen in the 1890s, plain and functional and made to last. It had lasted. The wood was dark with age, but solid. No rot. No warping. On the seat of the chair, centered precisely, was a leather-bound ledger with a brass clasp. Owen recognized it before anyone else. "That's the Harlow ledger," he said. His voice did something on the word Harlow, not quite a crack, more like a gear shifting. "That's the one from the archive catalog. I've read descriptions of it in 3 different historical indexes." He reached for it. I grabbed his wrist. He looked at me, startled. Not scared. He wasn't the scared type, I was learning, but genuinely surprised that someone had touched him without warning. I looked at the chair, at the ledger sitting exactly centered on the seat, at the way it was positioned with a precision that went beyond carelessness. This hadn't been left here. It had been placed. The way you place something on an altar. The way you set a plate at a table for someone who hasn't arrived yet. "Don't," I said. Owen pulled his hand back slowly. "I wasn't going to take it," he said. "Okay," I said. I hadn't been sure about that. I'd stopped him before I'd finished the thought. Instinct. Dale's voice in my head saying placed, not dropped. I looked at the floor around the chair, and that's when I saw the rest of it. A circle of small objects arranged on the wood planking around the chair's legs. Buttons. Old ones, bone and shell, the kind used on work shirts in the 1890s, hand-carved, each one slightly different from the others. Arranged in a ring about 4 feet across. Evenly spaced. Deliberately positioned. In the center of the ring, sitting on the ledger's cover, was a single Chinese coin. Round, square hole in the center, green with patina. The kind of coin that had been currency in China centuries ago and had traveled across the Pacific in the pockets of workers who came to Oregon to process fish and build buildings and do the work that nobody else wanted to do. The coin was clean and dry. Everything else in this corridor was damp. The walls wept moisture. The floor planks were swollen with it. But the coin sat on that ledger cover like it existed in its own climate, untouched by the wet and the cold and the years. My shoulders came up. The whole arrangement looked intentional in a way that made the back of my neck prickle. It looked like it belonged. It looked like it had been put there for a reason I could almost understand but not quite reach. Offering. Dale had said I'd know it when I saw it. He'd been right. "This is what Victor was looking for," Rachel said behind me. She already had her phone out, photographing the room, the chair, the button ring, the coin. Not with alarm, not with wonder, with the focused efficiency of someone documenting an expected finding, cross-referencing against a checklist she'd already prepared. "He found it," she said. "Where is he now?" I said. She didn't answer. She was examining the far wall. Behind the chair, partially hidden by shadow, was another opening. Not a doorway, a hole. Rough cut, leading to a set of stone steps that descended below the floor level. Below what should have been the building's foundation. The steps were worn smooth in the center from use. Not recent use. Decades of use. Maybe longer. The smell was stronger here. Coming up from below, in waves like something breathing. Marco moved to the top of the stairs and shined his light down. The beam went maybe 10 feet, and then the dark swallowed it. Not gradually. Completely. Like the darkness down there was denser than darkness had any right to be. "There's water down there," he said. "I can hear it." The Columbia River was 2 blocks away. We were already below sea level. The water made geological sense. Everything else about this did not. Rachel started down the steps without waiting for consensus. She didn't ask. She didn't look back. She just went, the way you go somewhere you've been planning to go for a long time. Suki followed. Owen adjusted his glasses and went after her. His hands were shaking slightly, but he was recording audio narration on his phone, describing the stone composition, the step dimensions, the geological context, and his voice was steady even when his hands weren't. I liked him for that. For doing the thing he knew how to do when everything else was outside his training.
Marco looked at me.
She knew this was here, he said quietly. Yeah, I said. She did. We went down. The stairs descended approximately 2 stories below the building's known foundation. The walls changed as we went down. Brick gave way to cut stone. Cut stone gave way to raw earth reinforced with timber. Old-growth timber, massive beams, the kind of wood that doesn't exist anymore because the trees it came from were cut down a century ago, and nobody planted new ones. The beams were dark with age and moisture, but solid. Whoever had built this space had built it to last in the same way they'd built the chair upstairs, functional, permanent, and without any interest in being admired. At the bottom, the stairs opened into a chamber. Large. Irregular. The ceiling was a mix of timber beams and raw rock, and the dimensions were wrong. Not wrong like a construction error. Wrong like the space had been carved partially from natural cavern and partially by human hands, and the two approaches hadn't agreed on the final shape. The floor was packed earth with standing water in the low spots. Black water.
Still.
It reflected our flashlights back at us like dark mirrors, and I had the disconcerting sensation of looking down at my own face, looking up at me from the floor. Along the walls, shelving. Rough-cut wooden shelving, floor to ceiling, holding objects. I moved my flashlight along them slowly. Jars with clouded glass, sealed with wax. Contents unidentifiable. Boxes of riveted tin with Chinese characters stamped on the lids. Bundles wrapped in oilcloth, some the size of a fist, others longer, cylindrical. A set of brass scales with counterweights still in place. Small carved figures, bone or ivory, I couldn't tell, depicting animals I didn't recognize. Not American animals. Not any animals I'd ever seen in any museum or field guide or nature documentary. Shapes that suggested something aquatic, but not quite. Something that lived in water, but wasn't entirely of it. There were dozens of objects, maybe hundreds. This was a vault, a collection. Elias Harlow had kept things down here, things that weren't in any official inventory, things that didn't appear in any cannery record or tax filing or insurance document. Things that existed below the building and below the record, and below the reach of anyone who might have asked questions about them. These are offerings, Owen said. He was moving along the shelves with his phone light, not touching anything, just reading. His voice had gone quiet in the way that voices go quiet in libraries and churches, and places where the air itself seems to expect respect. The workers left these. For the water. For whatever was in the water. He picked up one of the carved figures carefully and turned it in his hands. Harlow collected them, intercepted them before they reached the river. Why?
Suki said.
Owen set the figure back exactly where it had been. Because he could. Because he thought they were valuable. Because nobody was going to stop him.
He paused.
Because the people who made them didn't have the power to stop him. That sat in the chamber for a moment. Nobody added to it. Evidence of Victor Solis was scattered across the far end of the chamber. A modern LED lantern, dead battery, sitting on a shelf like another artifact. A notebook, Victor's handwriting, small and meticulous, the kind of penmanship that comes from years of cataloging objects in dim light. Pages of notes, some torn from the binding, scattered on the packed earth floor like someone had been working in a hurry or with shaking hands. I picked up the notebook and read by flashlight. His entries were catalog style. Object descriptions. Estimated dates. Provenance notes. He'd been documenting the collection the way a dealer documents inventory, clinical, thorough, assessing value. But the last few entries changed. The handwriting loosened. The clinical language broke down. One page near the back. The ledger confirms it. Harlow wasn't storing goods. He was storing payments. Offerings. The workers knew what was under the building. They'd been leaving things for it since the cannery opened. Harlow started collecting the offerings instead of letting them reach the water. He thought he could use them as leverage. Then, in larger letters, underlined twice. He was wrong. The last entry was on a torn page lying separate from the notebook, as if he'd ripped it out and dropped it. There's another level below this one. I can hear the water. I'm going down. A second set of stairs, rougher than the first. No timber reinforcement, cut directly into stone, descending toward the sound of moving water, slow, rhythmic, patient, like breathing, like something taking its time. The temperature dropped. My breath was visible now, small white clouds in the flashlight beam. The cold wasn't atmospheric. It was specific, targeted, like something was pulling the heat out of the air with intention. Suki stopped on the stairs and put her hand on the stone wall. Her face changed. "This isn't sandstone," she said. "This isn't basalt." She pressed her palm flat. "I don't know what this is." She was a structural engineer who'd assessed hundreds of buildings. She'd worked with every type of stone and concrete and composite material used in construction on the Oregon coast for the past 15 years. She sounded, for the first time, uncertain. Owen was recording everything on his phone. His hands were shaking, but his voice held. I liked him more for that. From below, from the bottom of the stairs, a sound. Not water, not mechanical. A low, sustained vibration that I felt in my sternum before I heard it with my ears. Like a building settling, but rhythmic. Purposeful. The kind of sound that means something is aware of you and is deciding what to do about it. Rachel stopped on the stairs. For the first time all night, she looked back at the group. Her face was lit from below by her flashlight, and the shadows made her expression hard to read. But I caught something in her eyes that might have been satisfaction. "We're close," she said. I thought about Dale's voice. Unhurried, careful, telling me about the things Elias Harlow collected. About the workers who left offerings at the water's edge. About what happened when the offerings stopped reaching their destination. The building keeps its own books. I hadn't asked what that meant. I was starting to understand. The stairs ended at water. Not a pool. A channel. Moving water, slow and dark, flowing from somewhere inland toward the river. The chamber at the bottom was partially flooded, water covering the floor to a depth of maybe 6 inches, black and cold enough that I felt it through my boots instantly. The ceiling was low. We had to crouch. The air tasted like iron and silt, and something else, something biological. Not rot exactly. Something alive. Something with a metabolism. Wooden pilings rose from the water at irregular intervals, old and encrusted despite being freshwater, and I understood that this space connected to the Columbia. Maybe to the bay beyond it. Maybe to something deeper than both. On a dry shelf of rock above the waterline, propped against a piling like someone had set him there carefully, was Victor Solis. He was alive. Barely. Dehydrated.
Disoriented.
A gash on his forehead that had been bleeding slowly for what looked like days, the blood dried brown and flaking at the edges. He was clutching the Harlow ledger to his chest with both arms wrapped around it, holding it the way a child holds a stuffed animal in the dark. His eyes were open, but they weren't tracking properly. They moved without landing on anything, sliding across our faces and our flashlight beams without recognition. Marco was already moving toward him. That's the thing about Marco. He doesn't decide to help someone. He's just already there. He got Victor's vitals in about 10 seconds. Pulse steady, temperature low, responsive to pain but not to voice. The kind of shape that means someone has maybe 12 hours before things start shutting down in the order they're not supposed to. He needs a hospital, Marco said. Hours ago. Victor's eyes found Marco's face. Something sparked behind them. Not quite consciousness. The ghost of it. It knows, Victor said.
His voice was wrecked.
Sandpaper on gravel. The kind of voice that comes from days of not drinking and hours of talking to something in the dark that didn't answer in words. It knows the offering stopped. It's been counting. His arms tightened around the ledger. His eyes slid past Marco and found the water. It's been counting for a long time. While Marco stabilized Victor, I watched Rachel. She wasn't watching Victor. She wasn't watching Marco work. She was at the shelving in the lower chamber, moving along the rows of objects with her phone out, photographing everything. Rapidly, systematically. The way someone photographs evidence when they know exactly what they're looking for and have been waiting a long time to find it. She picked up one of the carved figures, the bone ones, the ones that depicted animals I couldn't name, and turned it in her fingers. Held it close to her flashlight. Examined the base, the sides, the tool marks in the carving. Then she set it back and moved to the next object. Then the next. She wasn't documenting a crime scene. She was taking inventory. You've seen a list, I said. She didn't stop photographing. Harlow kept records. Victor found them. Victor's daughter found Victor's notes. Elena Solis hired you to find her father. Rachel lowered her phone. She looked at me directly for the first time since we'd entered the lower chambers. Her eyes were steady and her face was calm, and neither of those things made me feel better about what she was about to say. Elena Solis hired me to find what her father found. That landed different than anything else she'd said all night. The weight of it changed the shape of the room, changed the shape of why we were here, changed the shape of everything I'd assumed since the manila envelope hit my workbench. I looked at her. She didn't flinch. She didn't explain further. She just held the look and let me do the math. Victor Solis was never the primary objective. He was useful. His disappearance created urgency, created a reason to bring me and my skills into the building. But the real target had always been the collection, the offerings. The things on these shelves that Elias Harlow had stolen from the people who'd made them and hidden in a chamber beneath his building for over a century. Who's the real client? I said. Rachel picked up another carved figure. The bone was old, very old, yellowed and smooth in the way that bone gets when it's been handled by many hands over many years before it ended up on a shelf in the dark. Let's get Victor out first, she said. Then we'll talk. We didn't talk. We carried Victor up the stairs. Marco had him stabilized but not stable. There's a difference, and the difference is time, and we didn't have much of it. Victor was semi-conscious. He kept fading in and out, his eyes opening and closing on a rhythm that had nothing to do with our movement and everything to do with whatever his body was doing inside. He wouldn't let go of the ledger. Marco tried once to shift it so he could get a better grip under Victor's arms, and Victor made a sound, low, animal, desperate, and held on tighter. We let him keep it. The ascent was slow. The vibration from below continued, steady, patient, rhythmic. Like a pulse. Like something with a very large heart beating very slowly in the dark underneath us. I kept looking back down the stairs. Nothing followed us. Nothing appeared in the beam of my flashlight. The darkness just sat there at the bottom of the steps, thick and still, and somehow that was worse than if something had been climbing after us. Because it meant whatever was down there wasn't worried about us leaving. It knew we'd be back. Or it knew it didn't need to chase us. One of those. We reached the hidden room with the chair and the button ring. I stopped. The Chinese coin was gone. The ring of buttons was undisturbed. Every bone and shell button sat exactly where it had been when we'd passed through an hour earlier. The ledger was still on the chair. Victor had the real one, the one from the archive catalog, clutched to his chest, but this was a different ledger, older, and I hadn't looked at it closely enough to know what it contained. The chair hadn't moved. The arrangement was intact. But the coin that had been centered on the ledger's cover, clean, dry, green with patina, was no longer there. I looked at Rachel. Her right hand was in her blazer pocket. She saw me looking. She didn't take her hand out. She didn't explain. She just met my eyes and let the moment pass between us like a stone sinking through water. I filed it. My filing cabinet was beyond full now. It was overflowing. It was spilling onto the floor. We kept moving. We came through the breach into the archive room. The museum floor beyond was dark and quiet. I checked my watch. 2:47 a.m. We'd been below for almost 5 hours. The building felt different. I'd slept in this building for 11 months. I knew its sounds the way you know the sounds of your own body. Automatically, unconsciously, noticing only when something changes. The pipe groans. The elevator draft. The furnace cycling on and off. The small creaks of old timber adjusting to temperature shifts. The building was silent. All of it. Every sound I'd cataloged over 11 months of sleeping and waking and walking these floors gone. Not muffled. Not reduced. Absent. The furnace wasn't running. The pipes weren't groaning. The elevator shaft wasn't breathing. Suki noticed it too. She stopped in the archive room doorway and tilted her head, the way a dog does when it hears a frequency you can't. The building's holding its breath, she said. She meant it as a figure of speech. I looked at the walls, at the ceiling, at the way the fluorescent light in the archive room was flickering at a frequency that wasn't random, a pattern, slow, rhythmic, matching the pulse we'd felt below. I wasn't sure it was a figure of speech. We need to move, I said.
Now.
Out through the loading dock. Marco, can Victor walk? He can be carried, Marco said. Walking is optimistic. Then carry him. Let's go. We came out of the archive room into the main museum floor. Past the old fishing boats on their stands. Past the navigation equipment in its glass cases. Past the decommissioned Coast Guard lifeboat where tourists photograph their children. 3 people were waiting. They were positioned at intervals around the museum floor, one near the main entrance, one by the lifeboat exhibit, one near the corridor that led to the loading dock. Spread wide.
Planned.
They'd been here before we came up. They'd been waiting. 2 men and a woman. Dressed professionally, dark clothing, practical shoes, the kind of understated expensive that you don't notice until you notice it. One man had a sidearm visible on his hip, holstered but unsnapped. The other 2 had their hands at their sides in the specific way that means something is accessible but not yet drawn. The woman stepped forward 1 pace and stopped. Late 50s. Silver-streaked hair pulled back tight. Weathered face with lines around the eyes that came from years of examining small objects in variable light. Expensive watch, the kind that costs more than my truck and tells you less about the time than it tells you about the person wearing it. She looked at Rachel.
Not at me.
Not at Marco or Suki or Owen. At Rachel. Dr. Pine, she said. Not Ms. Not Agent.
Doctor.
I filed that so hard the cabinet broke. Nadia, Rachel said. Neutral. The voice of someone acknowledging a person they'd expected to see. Nadia Cortez. I learned her full name later. In the moment, she was just a woman who'd said doctor and changed the shape of everything I thought I understood about Rachel Pine. Nadia looked at all of us in turn. Unhurried. The way someone appraises items at an auction before deciding which ones to bid on. Her eyes lingered on Victor, still semi-conscious in Marco's arms, still clutching the ledger. Then she laid out her terms. She knew about the collection. She knew about the lower chambers. She knew what was on the shelves, the jars, the figures, the oilcloth bundles. She represented a buyer. Private. Overseas. Someone who collected things that weren't supposed to exist in the places they existed. She framed it as a straightforward transaction. The objects for a significant sum. Everyone walks away. Victor gets medical attention. No complications.
Clean.
She said it the way someone describes splitting a dinner check. Reasonable. Obvious. The kind of arrangement where everyone benefits and only a difficult person would object. While she talked, I watched her eyes. They kept sliding left. Toward Rachel. Not toward me. Not toward Marco. Not toward the loading dock exit. Toward Rachel. Watching for something. A nod. A signal. Some agreed-upon cue that would tell her the conversation had reached the point they'd discussed beforehand. Because they had discussed it beforehand.
That was obvious now.
Rachel and Nadia knew each other. This meeting wasn't an ambush. It was an appointment. The only people being ambushed were us. Rachel had her hands slightly raised. Not all the way up. Just the first gesture of someone about to negotiate. She was nodding a little. Reasonable. Patient. Making Nadia feel like the conversation had somewhere to go. I saw it coming about 1 second before it happened. I moved. Rachel drew. 1 round low. Nadia went down hard. Then everyone was moving at once. The first 3 seconds were just noise and geometry. Someone yelled. Someone fired back. The round hit a display case 6 inches from my head, and the glass came apart in a way that sounded expensive. I dropped low and moved right because that's what my body does when things go loud. Find cover, find angles, find the thing in the room that gives me options. Marco was already behind the lifeboat exhibit. He'd gotten Victor to the floor and covered him with his own body, which was very Marco. Not heroic. Just automatic. The thing his muscles did while his brain was still catching up. Owen was flat on the museum floor near a display of old buoys. And he had a pistol. I hadn't known he had one. Rachel must have given it to him. Or he'd brought it himself, which raised questions about Owen Chase that his Reed College student ID photo hadn't prepared me for. The man near the loading dock corridor was moving. Coming around the lifeboat exhibit, trying to flank Marco's position. His sidearm was up and he was moving well, trained, smooth, the kind of movement that comes from repetition rather than instinct. I had the lockpick set in my hand. Not a weapon. Not designed to be one. But the leather roll was heavy. 8 picks, 3 tension wrenches, solid brass and steel, and I'd crossed the distance before he saw me coming. I hit him at the wrist first. The leather roll connected, and his grip broke, and the sidearm clattered across the museum floor. Then the temple.
Once. Fast.
He went down. It was efficient and ugly and over in 4 seconds. I stood over him breathing hard, the lockpick set still in my hand, and I thought about Ankara and the consulate basement and the reason I'd left the bureau and the reason the investigation had gone quiet. The reason was that I was good at this. And being good at this scared me more than anything in the chambers below. The third person, the second man, looked at his 2 down colleagues. Looked at me. Looked at Owen, who was on the floor with a gun pointed at nothing now but whose hands were steady enough that it mattered. He made a fast decision. He ran for the main entrance. I let him go. That was a choice I'd think about later. Owen was breathing too fast. His glasses were crooked. He was looking at the gun in his hands like he'd found it there and wasn't sure how. He started. He hadn't fired. He hadn't needed to. But the question wasn't about the gun. It was about the version of himself that had been ready to use it. You're fine, I said. He lowered the gun slowly. Didn't say anything else. Nadia wasn't dead. The round had hit her vest, body armor under the blazer, which meant she'd come prepared for the possibility that this meeting wouldn't go the way she'd planned. She was down and she was done, but she was breathing. Rachel zip-tied her wrists with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this in other rooms, in other contexts, more times than a folklorist should have. I turned to Rachel. My voice was flat. Controlled. The kind of controlled that is more dangerous than yelling, because yelling means you've lost something and flat means you're still holding everything and deciding what to do with it. Talk, I said. She talked. Rachel Pine was not a private investigator. She was an academic, a folklorist and anthropologist specializing in indigenous spiritual practices of the Pacific Northwest. She held a doctorate from the University of Washington. She'd spent 15 years studying the intersection of indigenous spiritual traditions and colonial extraction, the systematic theft of sacred objects, ritual items, and cultural artifacts by the people and institutions that had colonized this region. She'd found references to the Harlow collection in obscure historical records, fragments of letters, coded entries in business correspondence, a footnote in a University of Oregon archive that mentioned a cannery operator in Astoria who'd been collecting curiosities from the Chinese workers' religious practices. She'd been looking for this collection for 7 years. Victor Solis had found it first. Victor's daughter, Elena, had found Victor's notes. Elena had contacted Rachel because Rachel's published work was the only academic reference to the Harlow collection that existed. But Elena hadn't hired Rachel to find her father. She'd hired Rachel to find the collection,
To document it.
to secure it, and yes, to return it, to find the communities whose ancestors had made these objects and give them back. That was the version Rachel had told Elena. The version Rachel hadn't told Elena, the version she was telling me now because I just watched her shoot someone, and because we were past the point of careful framing, was that Rachel also intended to document everything. Photograph every object. Catalog every carving and coin and oilcloth bundle.
Publish.
Present at conferences. Write the book that would define her career. The definitive account of the Harlow collection, its creation, its theft, its recovery. By Dr. Rachel Pine. You wanted to return them, I said. But you also wanted credit for returning them. She didn't deny it. Who should return them? I said. She didn't answer. But we both knew. The offerings were made by specific people from specific communities. The descendants of those communities still lived in Astoria, in Portland, in towns up and down the Columbia. The offerings belonged to them, not to return to decide. To decide what happened next. To decide whether the objects went back to the water or into a museum or into a fire or stayed exactly where they were. That decision wasn't Rachel's. And it wasn't mine. We're done here, I said. Jesse. We're done. Before Rachel could respond, the building made a sound. Not the furnace. Not the pipes. Not any mechanical system I'd spent 11 months maintaining and calibrating and listening to. This came from below.
Deep.
Structural. The floor vibrated once, hard enough to shift the dust on the display cases, hard enough to rattle the glass in the remaining intact exhibits, hard enough to make the decommissioned lifeboat rock on its stand like it was remembering water. The lights flickered. Not the random flutter of an electrical fault. A pattern.
Slow.
Rhythmic. Matching the pulse from the lower chambers. Owen looked up from the floor. His glasses were still crooked. That wasn't an earthquake, he said. No, Suki said. She had her hand flat on the wall, fingers spread, feeling the vibration the way she'd feel the vital signs of a patient if she were a doctor instead of an engineer. That was the foundation moving. The whole substructure just shifted. Not settling. Moving. Like something underneath it changed position. I looked toward the archive room. The breach in the wall was dark. The cold air coming through it was stronger now, not a draft, a current, a river of cold pushing through the opening and spreading across the museum floor, like water finding its level. And the smell. Copper and river silt and that biological undertone, the thing with a metabolism, the thing that was alive and old and had been breathing in the dark while we walked through its home and photographed its possessions and took the coin off the ledger and carried it up the stairs in Rachel's pocket. Something below us had noticed that the coin was gone, and it was coming to get it back. The water came first. Not flooding. Not a pipe burst. Not anything the building's mechanical systems could account for. Water emerged from the museum floor, pushing up through the gaps between the old wood planks, seeping through the cracks in the concrete foundation, rising in the low spots like the tide was coming in through the building's own bones. Black water.
Cold.
The same water from the lowest chamber. The same water that had been sitting flat and dark around Victor Solis while he clutched a stolen ledger and told us that something had been counting. It spread fast. Across the museum floor. Around the display cases. Around the lifeboat stand. Around our feet. An inch deep. Then 2. Then 3. Out, I said. Everyone out.
Now.
Loading dock. Marco had Victor up. Suki was already moving. Owen grabbed Victor's scattered notebook pages from where we'd stacked them earlier. Instinct, the academic's reflex to save the data, and shoved them in his pack. Rachel didn't move toward the exit. She moved toward the archive room. Toward the breach. Rachel. She turned. Her face was lit by the flickering overheads and the shadows made her look like 2 different people layered on top of each other. The academic who wanted to save the collection and the operative who'd shot someone to protect her access to it. The offerings need to go back down, she said. All of them. The coin was the trigger, but it's not enough. It knows the rest are still on those shelves. 100 years of stolen offerings sitting 20 feet below us. It wants them back. Then give back the coin, I said. She reached into her blazer pocket and produced it. The Chinese coin. Green patina. Square hole in the center. She held it in her palm, and in the flickering light I could see that it was warm, not reflecting her body heat, generating its own. The metal almost seemed to pulse. It's not enough, she said again. But it's a start. The floor buckled. A plank split lengthwise with a crack like a rifle shot, and water surged through the gap, and I felt the building shift under my feet, not an earthquake, not settling. Something underneath the foundation changing position. Something large. Then it came through the walls. The brick of the archive room breach darkened. Went wet. And something pressed through it the way water presses through a crack, finding every gap, filling every space, pouring into the room, not as liquid, but as shape. As form. As something that had been formless in the water, and was now remembering what it looked like when it had a body. I saw it in pieces because the brain doesn't process something like this whole. It gives you fragments and lets you assemble them later, in the dark, in the parts of the night when you wish you couldn't. A shape that filled the doorway.
Dark. Wet.
The surface of it wasn't skin, and it wasn't stone, and it wasn't wood. It was all of those things compressed and layered and moving, like the sediment of a riverbed had stood up and decided to walk. Silt and mineral and organic matter, old wood and old bone, shaped into something that approximated a living form the way a river approximates a road, following the same general principle but operating under completely different rules. Its proportions were wrong. Too long in the torso. Too many joints in the arms, if they were arms. The way they bent suggested additional elbows, additional wrists, points of articulation that human anatomy doesn't include, and human language doesn't have words for. It had a face. I'm using that word because I need a word, and face is the closest one I have, but it's doing work it wasn't built for. 2 points of reflection where eyes should be, catching the flickering. Overhead light, and giving it back green. The same green as old copper. The same green as the patina on the coin in Rachel's hand. It didn't move fast. It moved with the deliberateness of something that had been patient for over a century and saw no reason to rush now. The way glaciers move. The way rivers carve stone. Slow because speed is unnecessary when you have forever. The smell was total. Copper and silt and something ancient and biological. The smell of the river's memory, of water that had been in the same place long enough to become the place, of something that had been alive since before the building existed, and before the cannery existed, and before anyone had a word for what it was. Owen made a sound. Not a scream. A word he didn't finish because his throat closed around it. Marco shifted Victor's weight and didn't stop moving toward the loading dock. Suki had the door open and was waving them through, her measuring tape still clipped to her belt, her flashlight aimed at the creature like it might care about being illuminated. I stood between the creature and my team. I didn't decide to. I was just already there. The lockpick set was in my hand. Useless. The creature wasn't a lock. It wasn't a problem I could solve with precision tools and steady hands and the patient application of knowledge I'd spent years acquiring. It was something older than knowledge. Something that operated on rules I didn't have access to. But I had the coin. Rachel had pressed it into my hand when the wall darkened. I'd barely registered the transfer, her fingers closing mine around the warm metal, and then she'd stepped back and I'd stepped forward, and the transaction had happened without words, the way some transactions do. I looked at the creature. It was watching me, not advancing. Watching. The way something watches when it knows the boundary and is waiting to see what you'll do. Not threatening. Patient. The most frightening patience I'd ever seen, because it wasn't the patience of something that might give up. It was the patience of something that had never needed to. I thought about Dale, about his stories, about the offerings the workers had left at the water's edge, not because they were sure it would work, but because the leaving was the point. The acknowledgement. The admission that you shared a place with something older than you, and that sharing required respect. Harlow had broken that contract. He'd intercepted the offerings,
Collected them.
stored them on shelves like inventory, and the thing in the water had waited. Not because it was powerless, because it was patient, because it operated on a timeline that made human lifespans look like the flicker of a match. And now the match was out, and it was here, and the debt was due. I walked toward the archive room, toward the creature. My team was behind me, Marco's voice calling my name, Owen saying something I didn't catch, Suki's flashlight beam tracking my movement across the flooded museum floor. I passed within arm's reach of it. The cold coming off its body was physical, structural. The kind of cold that doesn't just lower your temperature, it changes the density of the air around you, makes your lungs work harder, makes your heartbeat sound louder in your own ears because everything else has gone so quiet. I went through the breach, down the corridor with the tally marks, down the first stairs, down the second stairs, into the lowest chamber where the water channel ran toward the river. The water was higher now, knee-deep, moving faster. I could feel the current pulling at my legs, pulling toward the river, toward the bay, toward the open Pacific beyond it. I set the coin on the water. It didn't sink. It sat on the surface for a moment, spinning slowly, catching the light from my flashlight and throwing it back green. Then it slid downstream, carried by a current I couldn't feel with my body but could feel with something else. Something in my chest, something old, something that recognized the rightness of a thing returning to the place it was supposed to go. The coin disappeared into the dark, and the vibration stopped. Not gradually. Immediately. Like a switch. Like a held breath released. The silence that followed was so sudden and so total that it had its own presence, a physical thing that filled the chambers and the corridors and the stairs and the building above me. I stood in the lowest chamber with black water around my knees and listened to the Harlow Building go quiet. Then I climbed back up. The creature was gone. When I came up through the breach into the archive room, the doorway was just a doorway again. Brick and mortar and cold air, and a hole in a wall that shouldn't have been there. The water on the museum floor was receding, draining back through the cracks in the planking, returning to wherever it came from, leaving dark stains on the wood that would be there for years. Maybe forever. The building sounded normal. The furnace kicked on.
Late.
Off schedule. But running. The familiar low rumble that had been my alarm clock for 11 months. The pipes resumed their groaning, the specific arthritic complaint of old iron expanding and contracting with temperature changes that the HVAC system couldn't quite manage. The elevator shaft breathed its slow draft. Everything the same. Everything exactly the same as it had been before we'd opened a wall and gone below and found a vault full of stolen prayers and woken something that had been counting in the dark for over a century. Except not everything. I came through the loading dock and found my team outside. Marco had Victor on the ground against the dock wall, wrapped in a thermal blanket from his medkit. Victor was conscious now, more lucid, his eyes tracking, his grip on the ledger finally loosened enough that Marco had been able to check his pulse without fighting for access. He looked like someone surfacing from a depth they hadn't expected to survive. Owen was sitting on a shipping crate near the dock's edge. His phone was in his hands, but he wasn't doing anything with it.
Just holding it.
Staring at the screen without seeing it. His glasses were still crooked from the museum floor. He hadn't fixed them. I don't think he'd noticed. Suki was leaning against the dock wall with her eyes closed. Her measuring tape was in her hand, unclipped from her belt for the first time all night, and she was gripping it like a rosary, running her thumb along the case in a slow rhythm that had nothing to do with measurement and everything to do with holding something familiar while the unfamiliar settled. Marco went to the spot where we'd staged our gear bags inside the loading dock earlier that evening. He knelt beside them.
Didn't open them.
Just put one hand on top of the nearest bag and stayed there for a moment, Head down, hand flat on the canvas. That was it. That was all he did. I understood. It wasn't about the gear. It was about something solid. Something that followed the rules. Something that was exactly what it appeared to be and nothing more. After what we'd seen below, that was worth kneeling for. Rachel was standing apart from the group, at the far end of the loading dock, looking at the building. The fog had thinned enough that the brick facade was visible, 3 stories of 1890s construction, dark windows, the faded painted sign from the original cannery still barely legible above the 3rd floor, Harlow and CO. Fish packing. She was looking at it the way you look at something you've been studying for years and have only just now actually seen. I didn't go to her. I didn't have anything to say that would fit between us in that moment. Later, maybe.
Not now.
I pulled out my phone. Not 911. I called the Astoria Police non-emergency line and reported a break-in at the Harlow Building Maritime Museum. An injured civilian found in the building's lower structure. 2 individuals detained on the museum floor following a confrontation. I said the civilian needed medical evacuation. I kept it short. The dispatcher asked me to repeat the part about the lower structure. I did. She asked me to clarify what I meant by lower structure. I said there were basement levels that weren't on the building's public floor plans. She told me to stay on the line. I set the phone down on a dock post and went to check on Victor. He was sitting up now. Marco had gotten in 4-line into his left hand, field work, the kind you do when you don't have a hospital but you have training and a medkit and the specific refusal to let someone deteriorate on your watch. Victor's color was better. Not good. Better. He looked up when I crouched beside him. Is it done? He said. I thought about the coin spinning on Blackwater.
About the way it had slid downstream into the dark.
About the vibration stopping, not winding down, not fading.
Stopping.
Like a held breath released. But I also thought about the shelves. The carved figures. The oilcloth bundles. The jars and the boxes and the brass scales and the 100 years of offerings still sitting in the chamber below us. The coin was one object. One debt acknowledged out of hundreds owed. The creature had accepted it and withdrawn.
For now.
For now was doing a lot of work in that sentence.
Part of it, I said.
He nodded. He looked back at the ledger in his lap. Then he did something I hadn't expected. He held it out to me. I shouldn't have taken it, he said. His voice was still rough, but steadier now. The voice of someone who'd been in the dark long enough to see clearly. I shouldn't have gone down there. I shouldn't have treated those things like inventory. I took the ledger. It was heavy. Heavier than leather and paper should have been, like it was carrying the weight of everything it recorded. Neither should Harlow, I said. He closed his eyes.
No.
Neither should Harlow. The police arrived in 11 minutes. Then an ambulance. Then a second car, a detective, young, with the specific energy of someone who'd been woken up for this and was trying to decide whether it warranted the interruption. They took Victor first. He went on a stretcher, the ledger still near him. I'd set it on the stretcher beside his leg because I didn't want it in my hands longer than necessary, and I didn't want it in Rachel's hands at all. The EMTs had questions about his condition. Marco answered them in medical terminology that made the younger EMT blink twice and then start writing faster. Former combat medics speak a different dialect of emergency, and it doesn't translate neatly into civilian. Marco's arm got looked at next. He'd taken a graze during the museum confrontation. Upper left arm, shallow, the kind he'd triaged and dismissed in the time it took the rest of us to register it had happened. He'd dressed it himself with gauze from his own kit. The paramedic who examined it said it needed proper cleaning and probably a stitch or 2.
Marco said it was fine.
I gave him the look. The specific look I'd given him in Istanbul and in Lagos and in a storage unit in Queens when he tried to walk off a fractured wrist. He got in the ambulance. Nadia Cortez went into custody. Her vest had saved her. Rachel's round had hit center mass and the body armor had done its job, which meant Nadia was bruised and furious, but breathing. The man I'd put down with the lockpick set was conscious and not talking. They both went in the back of the detective's car. Rachel answered questions with the polished composure of someone who'd been practicing her version of events for longer than tonight. She presented herself as a private investigator hired by Victor Solis's daughter. She presented the confrontation as self-defense against individuals who'd been trespassing in the building with weapons. She didn't mention the lower chambers. She didn't mention the offerings. She didn't mention the thing that had come through the wall. I let her tell her version. I told mine, simpler, shorter. I was the maintenance worker. I'd let the investigation team into the building. Things had gone wrong. I'd called it in. The detective wrote everything down and looked like he had follow-up questions, but also looked like he wanted to go back to bed. Fair enough. Some of the truth sounds less true than a lie, and the parts one was leaving out would have sounded like neither. Victor Solis recovered at Columbia Memorial Hospital. Elena Solis drove up from Portland the next morning. A liaison from Rachel's firm called me from the hospital lobby and asked if I wanted to speak to Ms. Solis directly. I said no. The liaison called back 2 hours later and said Ms. Solis appreciated my service and that compensation would be handled through the firm's accounting department. Accounting was never in touch. Rachel's fee, whatever arrangement she'd made with Elena, was tied to a contract that technically didn't exist in any form that would survive scrutiny, because the woman who'd structured it was an academic pretending to be an investigator, and the firm she'd invoiced through had been a shell set up specifically for this job and dissolved within 72 hours.
I looked into it for about a day.
Then I stopped. I'm not a lawyer, and I wasn't going to become won over a paycheck for a job I hadn't agreed to take in the first place. Owen went back to Reed College. 3 days later, I got an email from his student address. It said, "I keep checking my closet before I go to sleep. Is that normal?" I wrote back, "Yes." He didn't write again. Suki filed a structural report on the Harlow Building that recommended a full subsurface survey, citing anomalous subgrade spaces inconsistent with documented floor plans. Professional language for there are rooms under this building that shouldn't exist, and I'd like someone to explain them. The report got submitted to the Astoria City Planning Department. It was received, acknowledged,
Filed.
It stayed filed. Nobody followed up. Nobody scheduled a survey. The report sat in a folder in a cabinet in an office where someone had decided, consciously or not, that some questions are better left in their folders. Marco called once. A week after. We didn't talk about the building. We didn't talk about the creature or the water or the coin or the sound the floor made when something underneath it changed position. We talked about a Trailblazers game. Lillard had dropped 42 in a loss to the Nuggets. Marco had opinions. I let him share them. It was the best conversation I had in weeks. I went to Dale's bookshop on a Wednesday. 8 days after the lighthouse. After the building. After everything. I brought the coffee this time. 2 cups from the cafe on Commercial Street, black for me, something with cream and sugar for him. My end of the arrangement, reversed. It felt right. The bell above the door made its tired sound when I pushed in. The shop smelled the same as always. Old paper, binding glue, the faint mustiness of books that had been waiting for readers longer than most readers had been alive. Dale was behind the counter. He had a maritime history open, an old one, photographs of the Astoria waterfront from the 1890s. Cannery buildings lining the shore. Fishing boats crowding the docks. Chinese workers in the foreground of one photo, blurred because they'd been moving when the shutter opened. Not posing. Working. He didn't look up when I came in. He reached for the cup I set on the counter and took a sip and turned a page. "You're still in one piece," he said.
Most of it, I said. He looked at me then.
Just looked. He has a way of doing that where you feel like he's counting something. Not judging. Not evaluating. Counting. Taking inventory of the parts of you that are still where they were and noting the parts that have moved.
The building, he said. Yeah.
And the other thing. I thought about the shape filling the archive room doorway. The surface of it, silt and wood and bone and river. The eyes reflecting green. The patience of it. The absolute, geological patience of something that had been waiting since before the building existed and would be waiting long after it was gone. Yeah, I said. He nodded, like I'd confirmed a weather report.
Picked up his book. He told me a story that day.
About the river spirits the Chinook people knew. Entities that lived where the fresh water met the salt, patient and old, who remembered when the river was younger, who kept their own ledgers, who understood debt in ways that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the agreements that exist between living things and the places they live in. He told it the way he told all his stories, unhurried, like there was no particular reason to rush toward the end. I'd heard some version of it before. I used to think it was a good story, the kind that made you feel like a place had character. The kind you'd hear from a local in a bookshop and nod along to and then walk home and forget because the world outside the story was solid and explainable and didn't have things in the water that counted what they were owed. I didn't think it was just a story anymore. I finished my coffee and washed the cup in a sink and put it back on the hook where it lived. He was still reading. The things below the building, Dale said. They're not gone. I know, I said. Don't go back down there. I know. Not because of them, he said. He turned a page. Just because. I didn't ask him what that meant. I figured I already knew. Some doors you close not because of what's on the other side, but because of what you become if you keep going through them. I walked back to the building through the afternoon. The fog was thin. The river was flat and wide and very old. It always had been. The difference was I used to be able to forget that. I went back to work the next morning. Same routine. Midnight locks. 2 a.m. floor walk. 3:15 humidity sensor. It still drifted. It always drifted. Maybe it was the building. Maybe it was the sensor. Maybe it was the universe reminding me that some things resist calibration no matter how many times you try. The furnace kicked on at 4:47. Right on time. I lay on my cot in the mechanical room and listened to it and felt the building settle around me the way it did every morning. The pipes warming, the timber expanding, the elevator shaft sighing its low draft. Familiar sounds. Safe sounds. The sounds of a building being a building. Except, when I walked the third floor at 2 a.m., I paused at the cold spot on the stairwell landing. The one between floors 2 and 3. The one that never warmed up regardless of season. I used to walk through it. 11 months of walking through it without stopping. It was just a cold spot. A quirk of airflow. A draft from a gap in the exterior wall that nobody had ever bothered to seal. Now I stopped. Just for a moment. A nod. Barely perceptible. The kind you give a neighbor you don't know well but recognize. An acknowledgement that something occupied that space and I was passing through it, and the passage was not a right but a courtesy. The cold spot didn't change. Didn't warm. Didn't shift. But I felt, and I know how this sounds, and I don't care, I felt seen. Not watched. Seen. The way you feel seen when someone nods back. The archive room had been sealed by the city. Plywood over the breach. Caution tape across the doorway. A notice from the building inspector taped to the wall referencing Suki's structural report and recommending no entry pending further assessment. Further assessment wasn't coming. I knew that. The report was in its folder, and the folder was in its cabinet, and the cabinet was in an office where questions went to sleep. I walked past the plywood barrier every night on my rounds. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I could hear the air moving behind it. The faintest draft, cold, carrying the mineral smell of deep stone and old water. The building breathing through the wound weed made in its wall. I left it alone, but I started leaving things. Small things. A penny on the windowsill of the archive room door. Placed, not dropped. Centered on the sill with the kind of care that takes a few extra seconds and means something to the person doing it, even if they can't fully explain what. A button, a modern one, plastic, from a shirt I didn't wear anymore, set on the floor near the plywood barrier.
Placed.
A smooth river stone I'd picked up from the waterfront on my walk back from Dale's. Set on the loading dock threshold where the building met the outside air. Small things. Not valuable. Not ancient. Not carved from bone by someone a century ago who understood the water better than I ever would. Just gestures. Acknowledgements. The human equivalent of nodding at the cold spot on the stairs. I didn't know if it mattered. I didn't know if the gesture translated across whatever divide existed between my understanding and the buildings, between my sense of time and the rivers, between my life, short, confused, full of locked doors and things I'd done in consulate basements that I couldn't undo, and the life of something that had been here since before the water had a name. But Dale had told me once that the old people left offerings not because they were sure it would work, but because the leaving was the point. The acknowledgement. The admission that you shared a place with something older than you, and that sharing required respect. I left a penny every week. Nobody noticed. Nobody asked. And I made one phone call to a cultural heritage organization in Portland. I'd found them through a search that took about 10 minutes, which told me they weren't hiding. They were right there. They'd always been right there. I told a woman who answered about the Harlow Building, about the chambers below it, about the objects on the shelves, the carved figures, the coins, the bundles. I didn't tell her about the creature or the water, or the coins spinning on black water before it slid away into the dark. I told her there were cultural artifacts that belonged to her community, and I thought they should know. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that I checked to make sure the call was still connected. Then she said, "How did you find them?" I said, "Someone should have found them a long time ago." She said she'd send someone. I gave her Dale's number instead of mine. Dale would know what to say. He always knew what to say. And more importantly, he'd know how to listen, which was the part that mattered more. I hung up and went back to the humidity sensor. It had drifted again. 58%. I recalibrated it to 42 and knew it wouldn't hold, and did it anyway. Some things you do not because they're permanent, but because the doing is the point. I still showed up every morning, still checked the locks and walked the floors and reset the sensor that would never hold its calibration. Still drank coffee on the loading dock at dawn and watched the fog lift off the Columbia. Still nodded at tourists and answered their questions in as few words as I could manage. Still wore the Carhartt jacket with the collar up. The routine held.
Same as it always did. That part hadn't changed.
But when Dale told his stories now, I listened differently. Not like someone hearing a good yarn. Not like someone humoring a nice old man in a bookshop who sold maritime histories nobody bought. More like someone checking a map they wish they didn't need. The things under the building were real. They were close. And they'd been patient a lot longer than I'd been anything. Not patient like waiting. Patient like knowing. Knowing that the debt was still open. That the coin was one payment out of 100, that the shelves in the lower chamber were still full and the offerings were still intercepted, and the ledger, Harlow's ledger, the building's ledger, the river's ledger, was still unbalanced. They'd wait. They were good at waiting. They'd been good at it since before anyone had a word for patient. That was the part that stayed with me. The furnace kicked on at 4:47. I finished my coffee. I set the cup on the dock post where it always went. The river was flat and wide and old. The building stood behind me, brick and timber and hidden rooms, breathing through its walls. The fog came in from the Pacific the way it always did, slow and certain, covering everything in a wet gray light that made the whole waterfront look like a photograph of itself, something already past, already memory, already a story someone would tell in a bookshop to a person who might or might not believe it. I went back inside.